Steve Blackman then, some call him the Chuck Norris of wrestling, while some call Chuck Norris the Steve Blackman of acting. Nevertheless, Steve Blackman managed to gain respect from wrestling fans over the years, and this in itself is quite intriguing. Steve's biggest contributions to wrestling occurred during the Attitude Era, an era that was all about being over the top and letting your character come out of their shell. Blackman, however, was a man who walked to the ring, got the job done, and walked back up the aisle. Sure, he did do promo spots and he had some glow-in-the-dark sticks that he would carry around, but by and large, Steve Blackman was kind of a silent lone wolf for a fair portion of his career. With this in mind, fans still liked him, and fans to this day still remember him fondly, creating an exception here and proving that you didn't need to be this over-the-top and loud character to get fan support during the Attitude Era. I'm not saying that Steve Blackman sold a bunch of merchandise and main evented pay-per-views. He was firmly put into the WWF mid-card at the time, and eventually he moved into the hardcore division, but the guy had his share of fans, and still to this day, most wrestling fans who watch the Attitude Era will nod in approval at the mention of Steve Blackman's name. So let's dig into Steve's career and hopefully we can learn a thing or two. His journey in professional wrestling, as you'll soon find out, was pretty interesting to say the least. Steve was born on September 28, 1963 in Annville, Pennsylvania. Before breaking into the wrestling business, Steve studied martial arts, and along with this, he was also a competitive bodybuilder. Seeing the earning potential in professional wrestling while already having a great physical discipline, Steve decided to get pro wrestling training in Connecticut from Tony Altimore. Before this, Steve was working in bars around Florida and he needed a change in career. He wasn't happy and he felt unfulfilled working a normal job. Many believe that Steve Blackman began wrestling in 1997 in the WWF, but no, Blackman actually began working in 1986, performing in shows put on by Tony Altimore. His first big break came when he got the opportunity to tour with New Japan Pro Wrestling in January of 1988. Steve wrestled as Steve R. Blackman in Japan, and to be fair, he suffered a lot of losses during his month-long stay with NJPW. As fate would have it, another young wrestler was on this very same tour by the name of Owen Hart. Owen suggested that Steve should call his dad Stu after this New Japan tour was up in order to get some work with Stampede Wrestling, and this is exactly what happened. Just before he debuted in Stampede though, Steve had two matches with the WWF. The first was a win over David Sammartino at a house show, and the second saw him losing to the Islanders while teaming up with Brady Boone and Outback Jack. This tag match was televised. It aired on May 7th, 1988, and you can watch it right now on YouTube. The WWF liked what they saw, and the company would keep an eye on Steve when he began working for Stampede. Steve spent the remainder of 1988 working for Stampede, where he grew an admiration for Stu Hart, saying he was fond of Stu because he was no nonsense and he told it like it is. Eventually, the WWF got in contact and discussions began around Steve's possible WWF contract. The WWF wanted Steve to have some final tryout matches before he signed a deal, but Steve had already agreed to tour South Africa with another promoter. The WWF were fine with this. They wanted Steve to finish his obligations the right way, so Steve packed his bags and went to South Africa, knowing he had his big final WWF tryout waiting for him when he got home. On this tour of South Africa, Steve contracted malaria, and to be honest, what the guy went through is difficult to even read. I'm going to add a link in the description if you want to learn more. Steve done an interview where he talks in depth about his illness, but it was extremely serious. Steve got back home and tried to have his tryout match against Iron Mike Sharp, but he was still sick and he decided he needed to stay home to get better. Steve was pretty much bedridden for nearly 2 years, and it seemed like his WWF aspirations were over. Steve had a difficult time while he was ill. He had worked out every day since he was a teenager, and now he was unable to do anything. Steve said, I couldn't stand it because I had been working out from the time I was 13 years old, so not being able to train was eating at me. Not being able to bang on the heavy bags and wrestle people was driving me crazy. I couldn't do anything physical. If I dropped down to the floor and did 50 push-ups, I would be tired for 2 or 3 days. I will never forget, I had an 85-pound dumbbell at home. I would pick it up and do one set of curls on this arm and another on the other arm, and I would just sleep for 2 or 3 days. It was just awful. Steve said at the height of his illness he would sleep for 18 to 20 hours per day, and that lasted for around 2 years. Slowly though, he began feeling better, and he was able to get to a gym and stay for 10 minutes or so. The next time he went, he stayed for 15 minutes, and gradually he began expanding his time in the gym while recovering. Physically and mentally, Steve was getting better. He took up Eskrima and Taekwondo during this time, with the Eskrima training getting quite a bit of use in his WWF character later down the line. Anyway, Steve felt he could maybe talk to the WWF once again and possibly get hired. Vince McMahon was hesitant, with Blackman being out of the ring for so long. Vince wasn't sure if signing him was the best idea, but Steve got another tryout and he was hired by the WWF in mid-1997. So on the November 3rd, 1997 episode of Raw, Steve Blackman made his second WWF TV appearance when he jumped the guardrail to help Vader, who was getting attacked by the Hart Foundation, Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn. He was portrayed as a fan who just jumped into the ring, and the WWF done quite a good job here, as Vader actually jumped on top of Blackman too, making it look like this wasn't supposed to happen. The next time we would see Steve Blackman was that same week, just 6 days later at the 1997 Survivor Series in Montreal. Steve Blackman represented Team USA in a Survivor Series match, and along with Vader, Goldust and Mark Merrow, he lost in his pay-per-view debut against Team Canada that featured Davey Boy Smith, Jim Neidhart, Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn. Steve was counted out in his debut match here and was the first eliminated from his team, but the countout at least somewhat protected him. Before the match, Steve had a small bit of mic time, and we have to be honest here, he didn't seem like a natural on the mic at all. The next night on Raw, he again had a brief interview with Jim Ross before taking out the entire Broicos faction, but again he didn't seem comfortable at all talking here. This isn't to discredit the guy at all. Steve Blackman will be the first to tell you he was more comfortable doing his thing inside the wrestling ring, and promos weren't something that he flourished in. Still, I think this was to his benefit. Just let him go out there and wrestle. Let him be the silent but fierce type. His in-ring work should do the talking for him. Anyway, just a quick side note, Steve Blackman was thrown into the Survivor Series match so quickly due to the Patriot getting injured. Steve was his replacement. You can also see here that Steve was given the full martial arts gimmick, outfit and all. Steve said it was actually he who chose to wear the karate pants during matches, something that Vince McMahon didn't like, due to McMahon himself saying that Blackman had really muscular legs, and so he should wear tights. He always worked in the karate pants. Anyway, Vince McMahon's fashion desires aside, Steve's in-ring style was unique, blending in a range of hard-hitting strikes and kicks into his wrestling moveset. It's probably a good time to also mention that Steve was pretty legit. Many of his peers talk about how tough he really was and how he enjoyed working stiff in the ring. You can find many stories of Steve Blackman not backing down from the usual backstage bullies and standing up for himself, and people also feeling his wrath, such as Mr. JBL himself. Steve Blackman was no nonsense, he was tough, he wanted to clock in for work and go home without any drama, and this I feel was to his credit. It's refreshing to hear about a wrestler who just wanted to do his job and not get dragged into the usual shenanigans. Steve's first match on Raw happened on the December 15th episode in 1997, scoring a win over Jose Estrada of Los Boricuas. Steve was getting a good reaction here, and the match was over pretty quickly. His next big appearance was at the 1998 Royal Rumble, entering at number 10 but getting eliminated by Kurgan. Blackman then went on quite the winning streak, defeating Farouk and The Rock on back-to-back Raw shows, kickstarting a feud with The Nation here that saw Blackman frequently team up with the world's most dangerous man, Ken Shamrock. Around this time, Steve Blackman started messing around with the glow-in-the-dark nunchucks before his matches. The WWF must have felt here he could do with a small gimmick to add a little character. Either that or someone watched his old Stampede videos. Steve's next pay-per-view appearance occurred at Unforgiven when he, Shamrock and Farouk, who had now left the Nation by this point, defeated D'Lo Brown, The Rock and Mark Henry in an extremely good and quite forgotten 6-man tag match. Blackman then entered the 1998 King of the Ring, but he was defeated by Mark Merrow in the first round. His tag partner Ken Shamrock went on to win the whole tournament. The next thing of note then that Blackman got involved in was the Brawl for All, a legit fight tournament that I think gets way too much hate, but anyway, wrestlers who entered the Brawl for All were given a cash bonus and entry was on a voluntary basis, so this tournament could pretty much settle who the real tough guys of the WWF were. Again, people rip on this tournament and I can see why. The ratings themselves are indicators that the tournament didn't go down well and people generally tuned into wrestling to see wrestling. And people in the arenas sure didn't like it either, but I really didn't think it was as bad as everyone makes it out to be. Anyway, we will talk about the tournament in another video. Blackman went up against Mark Merrow in the first round and he won on points, but he had to exit the tournament due to a knee injury. Upon his return, Steve Blackman had a brief feud with Ken Shamrock before turning heel. He sided with Shane McMahon, acting like a kind of henchman for Shane, and eventually Steve would begin doing Vince McMahon's dirty work also. Vince wanted Ken Shamrock taken out and Blackman was the man hired to do the job. At Fully Loaded 1999, Shamrock and Blackman met in an Iron Circle match, pretty much a parking lot brawl where the winner would be the man who could walk out of the circle of cars that were parked in the middle of the lot. Ken Shamrock won this match. The feud would continue into SummerSlam 1999 where the pair faced off in a Lion's Den match. Shamrock also won this match. Steve Blackman's next feud was with Val Venus, leading to a match at Unforgiven 1999 that the big Val Boski won. From here, Steve Blackman formed a tag team with Al Snow, known unofficially as Head Cheese, as Al Snow made Blackman wear a cheese hat to complement Al's mannequin head. Before settling on the name Head Cheese, Al Snow was badgering Steve Blackman on a regular basis, trying to come up with a tag name while Blackman remained unenthusiastic about the whole thing. The WWF here were announcing to the world that they thought Blackman had zero personality and they were going to try and capitalise on it with comedy. People kinda like this. It was Blackman's first real attempt at trying something out of his comfort zone, and what's funny about it is the storyline was really all based around Blackman's nature of being a no-nonsense guy. Blackman eventually gave in, coming to the ring wearing a cheese hat with indifference while Al Snow remained upbeat and passionate about the tag team. Al would attempt to get Blackman to do some silly things, and most notably, he forced an unsuspecting Blackman to perform a stand-up comedy routine at a nursing home, leading to Blackman nearly destroying an elderly lady with his nunchucks. Head Cheese never did win the tag titles, but they were featured at WrestleMania 2000 in a losing effort against TNA. All in all, people remember Head Cheese thanks to Blackman being put out of his normal comfort zone, and it kinda done what it was supposed to do, giving us some entertaining segments and also some underrated matches. After Al Snow and Steve Blackman split up, Steve became a regular in the WWF's Hardcore division. In the end, the Hardcore title was won by Blackman 6 times during this time period, so you can tell here that this is where Blackman would be firmly established. In the Hardcore division, Steve was able to fully utilise his skills with kendo sticks and nunchucks, all that stuff, to their maximum potential. He became a complete animal when he competed in Hardcore matches. Steve is kind of an unsung hero of the hardcore division, going on to hold the title for more combined time than anyone else with a total of 172 days. Blackman lost the title for the first time in a match against Shane McMahon, leading to a rematch between the two at SummerSlam, and this one is well remembered by fans thanks to Shane falling off the Titantron during the showdown. We always see the clip of Shane falling from the Titantron, but we never see the clip of Blackman jumping off with a diving elbow drop. Granted, he took a few steps down before jumping. It wasn't as spectacular looking by any means, but it was still pretty high up. Anyway, this is one of Blackman's most well remembered matches during his time in the World Wrestling Federation, and for good reason too. The whole match is pretty fun. Just before calling it quits in wrestling, Blackman teamed up with Grandmaster Sexay. This team was kind of reminiscent of Head Cheese, with the Grandmaster trying to get Blackman to dance before and after matches, while Steve was initially reluctant to do so. Steve did show his dance moves on one or two occasions though. Brian Christopher ended up getting released from the WWF, and that put an end to this short-lived tag team. Steve Blackman's final Raw match then was a King of the Ring qualifier in June of 2001, taking a loss here to Perry Saturn in around 2 minutes. His last WWF match happened the following week when he defeated K-Quick, better known as R-Truth, in a match taped for the international version of Sunday Night Heat. Blackman was only supposed to take a break from wrestling due to a nagging neck injury, but in the end, the damage proved to be too much for Blackman and he wouldn't be able to continue travelling on the road, and his WWF career was over. Blackman did work a little for the Heartland Wrestling Association in Ohio, but he was pretty much fully retired by the end of 2001. In 2007, Steve made a one-off appearance at the Raw 15th Anniversary Special, taking part in a Battle Royal. Steve looked great here. It seemed like he didn't age a day and he was in great shape. Blackman then opened up his own gym and self-defense school called Blackman MMA. With mixed martial arts gaining more mainstream traction, there was no shortage of students, and Steve Blackman was able to make a comfortable living while training jiu-jitsu, kickboxing and other disciplines. And along with this, incredibly, Steve Blackman has become a bail bondsman. I highly recommend you check out his YouTube channel. His advertising videos are fantastic and have seemingly gone under the radar. But yeah, Steve Blackman, bail bondsman.
Now there's an easier way to do this. If you want out of jail, call Blackman for bail. As a former WWF friend.
And that's the story of Steve Blackman in the WWF. Sure, he may have been lacking in the promo department during his time with the company, but at the same time, he remained employed throughout the Attitude Era thanks to his reliability, his resilience, and his in-ring abilities. This, I feel, is a great accomplishment when you consider the over-the-top antics that went on during this era of professional wrestling. It's fascinating though to think about how Steve Blackman would have fit into the WWF in late 1989 and beyond, and it's debatable if he would have even survived in the company with the larger-than-life characters who roamed in the World Wrestling Federation during this time period. But anyway, take the time to go back and check some of Steve Blackman's matches out. You may be surprised at what you see.